Okay. So DC is a system that uses an education governance structure that we call mayoral control. It started in 2007 upon the passage of a law called the Public Education Reform Act in the DC Council. But I'm going to kind of start at the top. This is more or less an organizational chart. So usually what that means is those that are up on the higher end have more power, and then it kind of works its way down. That being said, it's not the same as a typical organizational chart because there is a lot of fluidity between the different groups, and it's not quite a clear hierarchy in a lot of cases. And that does cause a lot of confusion in this district when it comes to who do you even go to when you have certain problems. And then on the right-hand side, we do have just kind of national groups, and I'll be talking about more of those as well. So I'm going to start with the federal government. Oops, sorry. Okay, so the U.S. federal government is the organization, right, that creates the kind of larger framework of national laws that all states in the District of Columbia are expected to follow. And of course, we currently have our Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos. Some of the key legislation or policies that currently affect us are the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, which was the update of No Child Left Behind under Obama. IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, Education Act, excuse me. And then we have two DC specific laws, as I'm sure we all know. Yes, and No Child Left Behind was from Bush. But ESSA is the Obama update, or under Obama update. In 1995, Congress, a Republican Congress led by Newt Gingrich, passed over the objection of our own Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton, the DC School Reform Act in 1995. This created the Public Charter School Board and set up our public charter school system. As we'll kind of see, this really has some long-term consequences for the district, not just because of the number of charter schools, but in the way that all of our other agencies and elected leaders react to them and act with them. So it was created by Congress, it was created by a Republican Congress, and in my personal opinion, anyone who advocates for maintaining this law is against DC statehood, because this was not something that's been given any control in the district over, at least from certain people's perspective. We also have the only national private school vouchers program. States have private school vouchers programs, but this is the only national one, which is the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program. Some interesting notes about that. All the studies that have been done on it have shown that students have poorer outcomes than those who attend public schools by a pretty large order of magnitude. So this is arguably not a successful program. It is also passed over the objection of Eleanor Holmes Norton as well. At this point, it's not highly controversial. It's not a very large program, but it does still exist and is a tool of arguably privatization. Are there any questions just on federal government? That's probably the simplest one since all the states have to deal with at least the national laws. Though as you can see, DC does have DC specific ones. All right, so let's dive in a little bit to mayoral control. So, sorry, I'm just trying. So DC largely has two major branches of government, the executive and the legislative. The executive is, of course, run by Muriel Bowser, our mayor, who is elected every 4 years. She has 2 years left in the middle of her second term. Everyone in here is arguably below the mayor, though, as I mentioned, the DC Public Charter School Board believes that they are not. Okay, we'll get to that. Under Mayor Bowser, we do have the city administrator, Rashad Young. I mention him really because he comes up in our contract negotiations a lot when it comes to finding money in the government. He is often the person that the mayor turns to. Then we have the deputy mayor for education, Paul Kine. Paul Kine would arguably be directly under Mayor Muriel Bowser. He is overseeing the schools as well as the libraries, and that's pre-K and even the, I believe, childhood centers, all the way through the universities. So it's really kind of a lot of things under education. And he's supposed to be coordinating a district-wide education strategy. Some of the things that are going on or have gone on under the deputy mayor that are kind of worth watching are My School DC and the school lottery system, which provides kind of one common lottery for all the schools and is arguably a pusher of school choice by making it easier and simpler for parents to make those choices and by rating and pitting schools against each other in a fight to the death over students and resources. We have the DC Cross-Sector Collaboration Task Force. It's a mouthful. It's actually no longer meeting. It didn't really come up with much, but the whole goal was to have people come together to try to get the charter schools and DC public schools to be interacting more. But not much has come of that. We have the, master facilities plan or the facilities master plan. There's a law written by the council that requires the mayor's office to come up with a facilities master plan. She has yet to do so, so she's been out of compliance with the law for several years now. The idea here would be that because charter schools and DCPS are often competing for a limited number of public buildings, that there should be a plan for this. The only thing that came out that they tried to call a plan, but that the council said was not in fact a plan, because it wasn't, was a series of goals, which for those of us who attended the meetings, of which very few of us did, but we believed that really these goals were how to better shut down public schools and turn them over to charters more efficiently and more quickly. And we know that charter school lobbyists are working very hard on trying to make a facilities master plan that allows them to co-locate with public schools and eventually take over public schools, that makes it faster for them to get access to public schools that they deem as not being used. So that's something definitely to watch, because this is one of kind of the key battlegrounds over preserving neighborhood public schools and preventing privatization. They also have a truancy task force. They started that Everyday Counts campaign. This was meant to bring a lot of different nonprofits and other agencies together to talk about and try to address student attendance. And it's a potentially positive place. We then have the schools. So in the center here, we have the Office of State Superintendent of Education, or OSSE. OSSE, their job is to serve as the quote unquote state agent for federal legislation and managing grants. They set the policies for DCPS and the DC public charter schools when it comes to implementing ESSA, IDEA, and any other federal grants, programs, or legislation that affects schools. Some of the things to watch, they're still dealing with ESSA enforcement and the school report cards in particular. They also deal with student transportation. What makes DC so unique is that typically this truly would be a state agency and therefore could oversee districts that have mayoral control. So for example, Chicago and New York both have mayoral control of their schools, but in both of those cities, they have additional state agencies that oversee. Aussie could argue, well, Aussie is considered to be under the Deputy Mayor of Education. So it's not necessarily that it's low on the pipeline. It would be over DCPS and DC Public Charter Schools, but my ability to make that like really demonstrate is about 0. So I put them in the middle. They would technically be a little bit higher than DCPS and the DC Public Charter School Board. Tiffany, to your question about Ward 3, I'm not entirely sure, but when I get to the council, we can talk about that a little bit. And if you have more information, feel free to share. So we have Aussie, and again, they're supposed to be managing the federal laws and programs, but they are under the mayor the same way the DCPS is under the mayor and the DME is under the mayor. Instead of being separate and independent of the mayor. And so mayoral control in DC is truly unique because there are no checks and balances out of this agency. The way that in any other state where cities have mayoral control, there would still be some form of checks and balances. And the superintendent is appointed by the mayor, as is the deputy mayor for education, as is the chancellor of DC Public Schools, as are the members of the DC Public Charter School Board. They are all appointed by the mayor, and then the council has to agree to them. And when we get to the council, we'll see they've proven to be a rubber stamp when it comes to agreeing to all of these people. So the mayor really has a lot, has the influence and control over the education system in the district. So if we look over to the left of the Aussie, we have DC Public Schools. Our Chancellor, Louis Farabee, and I'm just also mentioning Deputy Chancellor. I like to refer to as the Shadow Chancellor, Melissa Kim, since everyone kind of thinks she's probably the one really running this show right now. They run DC Public Schools, which is served as the largest LEA or local education agency in the district. So DCPS is one called LEA, and we are under the purview of the mayor. They have strategic plans, they handle our contracts, we have issues with data and transparency, they've tried to extend the day and the year, and then they've walked it back. They've implemented restorative justice, and of course, I'm not updated this super recently, but reopening of the schools is obviously part of their purview. And they're, of course, the ones that we interact with. But as you can kind of see, there's not really anyone we can go to here that isn't under the mayor and their control if we have issues with DCPS itself, which we'll continue talking about that. And then just have the DC Public Charter School Board. Their mission per the federal law is to approve and revoke charter applications and set policies. We're always watching them for new charter authorizations. They usually start 3 to 5 new schools a year, and they consistently keep expanding the number of charter schools, which makes it more difficult for DC Public Schools and the existing charter schools to continue to exist. Why do I think Melissa Kim's running DCPS? I think a lot of it's political. Melissa Kim wishes she was chancellor. She tried to be the DME. Both times behind the scenes, people's outcry shot that down before the mayor could do it. She was the former principal of Deal, and she then went over to KIPP DC, which is the other big power player in DC education, arguably. And so she's kind of got all the connections to want to be chancellor, but she's so unpopular that was never going to happen. So I think she just has a lot of power by being the deputy chancellor, right? And she's come and spoken to us now at a couple PDs, which, is kind of coming out from behind the curtain, in my opinion, which is never a good idea for her. If you've ever seen her try to do her thing in a public meeting, all she does is piss everybody off. She's very good at that. So, yep, you always want to watch the Public Charter School Board. They have public meetings that we can watch online for new charter authorizations, expanding the number of charter seats. So not only are they opening new charter schools every single year, they're also expanding or raising the ceiling on how many number of students those charters can have. They do also revoke charters, and oftentimes the way they do that is often in the poorest areas of the city, and they're closing these schools, leaving the families scrambling with nowhere to go. And so even though I personally am not a big fan of charters, I have fought against charter closings, largely because of the way they're being done and who they're targeting. And usually, in my opinion, the Public Charter School Board targets charter schools to close that I believe are actually doing the work of serving students that weren't even successful in DC public schools, instead of like the KIPs of the world that just take the top students and expel everybody else. So, you know, I think we have now one unionized charter school. We had a second, but they closed it. And, you know, I think it is kind of an avenue that potentially, you know, we can see and find allies in the teachers in those charter schools, because they have even less rights than we do most of the time. And they're worth watching, and they can be very hostile to our public schools. And of course, they try to grab our buildings on the regular. And frankly, they put a lot of pressure to close some of our schools, usually based on test scores, the way that they close theirs, in order to try and grab our buildings. So it's something to watch. So this is all kind of directly under the executive, although the executive will often say, the mayor will often say that she has basically no control over the DC public charter school sector. There's a lot of arguments, legal ones, that would disprove that. It's a political position for her to take, saying she has no control and there's nothing she can do and they can just do whatever they want. Because frankly, it's not true. They have to follow health laws, they have to follow national laws, and they have to follow district laws. So this idea that somehow the mayor cannot ever tell charters what to do is just ludicrous. But she says it to keep them happy, because they have a lot of lobbyists, as we'll see on the right later. Are there any particular questions on kind of the executive and that structure? I know I go very fast. I apologize. All right. So now we can go over to the left with the council. So this is kind of the legislative side of things. Really, we have the Council of DC. The chair is Phil Mendelson, Democrat in the middle of his term. So 2 more years of this torture. We've endorsed people to run against him, but Phil manages to win. The Education Committee right now is in a funny state because it's the only committee with a co-chair, which is Phil Mendelson and David Grasso. My opinion is because David Grasso did such a poor job, but no one else wanted to deal with it, that Phil decided to co-chair it with him. On the Education Committee, we have Charles Allen from Ward 6, Anita Bonds at large, Robert White at large, and Tran White from Ward 8. In the council, committees have a lot of power. When there's only 13 members, they really don't like to rattle each other's cages. So if the chair does not want to put something up for a hearing or to move legislation forward, the other council members, even if they disagree with it, often won't really challenge it because they want kind of to have that power in their committees. And because there's only 13 of them, making us the smallest legislature in the country, by a lot, for considering that we have the budget of a state and we act like a state for pretty much all intents and purposes, it really makes it hard to get things done if we have an obstructionist like David Grasso sitting as chair. Now, Phil assigns the chairs, so this is also Phil Mendelson's fault, and he also often opposes WTU initiatives and is pretty hostile and anti-teacher more often than not. The council writes legislation, they set the budget, and they conduct oversight of executive agencies. They are the ones who instituted mayoral control. Phil Mendelson likes to remind us all the time that he is the only current sitting council member who voted against it. That'd be because no one's left on it practically, thanks to us getting rid of Jack. But they are then the ones who can change it. So the council are the ones who can change mayoral control. Trayon White, also 2 years, not soon enough for Phil. Trayon White put up legislation, or he proposed legislation on behalf of the WTU about negotiating our evaluation system as public employees. Phil Mendelson has refused to hold an education committee hearing on that. And David Grosso is a non-starter because David Grosso has never met a teacher he's liked. So that's going to be, an issue that we're going to have to continue to work on, trying to, I guess, convince Phil that there should be a hearing and that people should get a chance to testify, discuss, and debate whether or not teachers should be allowed to negotiate our evaluation. Of course, we want to negotiate our evaluation so we can get rid of impact and have something that actually works and is maybe actually responsive to our needs and is centered on growth instead of punishment, so we no longer have one of the highest rates of teacher churn in the nation. Another law that potentially is worth exploring is the DC Hatch Act. The DC Local Hatch Act is the law that decides who can and cannot run for public office. Right now, teachers are not allowed to run for public office in the district if it is partisan. So we can't run for council, and we can't run for mayor, we can't run for AG. But in most jurisdictions, teachers can. So there is, a lot of cause to consider wanting to get rid of this so that we can run our own people against some of these elected leaders. The Public Education Reform Act, mayoral control, also made it so that teachers, public school teachers, can't run for the State Board of Education, which is nonpartisan. So normally we should be able to run, but Mayoral Control Act actually prevents us from doing so. When it comes to, so another thing that the council can do is they can decide what happens to our public land. They could decide to give it to a charter on a low, on a real cheap 50-year lease. They could decide to give up the public land entirely to the private sector. And I think this is where the part that Tiffany was bringing up about Foxhall comes in. And they can also purchase public land. I don't know, Tiffany, do you want to share? I've read about it, but admittedly, Ward 3 real estate is not something that I pay much attention to, even though it's important.
Well, no, I thought maybe you would have some information because I just thought it was really interesting how buildings in Ward 7 and 8 go like for $1. But that Foxhall Elementary, whatever that Foxhall building was, they kept it and would not let it turn over to charter. I just thought that was really interesting in how that council member saw to it so that the city could purchase it or make sure that it remained district owned. And I just thought maybe you would have more information on that as to why that was or how that was. Because you're so smart, Laura.
Well, I think you raise a really good point in that clearly where there's a will, there's a way. If the council wants to protect public buildings, they can, and they do. And when they don't care about public buildings, when they decide to disinvest in communities, typically those east of the river, then they do that instead. I don't know, the particular politics behind this, but it is exceedingly troubling how transparent our council is and how little they care for east of the river public property compared with public property in wards 3 and 2. It's certainly something that we can look more into and try to see how we can be more involved as a union and as union members in making sure that we are preserving and protecting public space, as well as making sure that all of our schools are getting their due. Underneath the council, we have the DC auditor. Kathy Patterson has proven to be an excellent ally of the WTU because she believes in the truth. And it's kind of shocking how few of our elected leaders, especially those under the mayor, have any care or thought about the truth. So Kathy Patterson, as the DC auditor, the council can give her tasks, things to research. She has a small office near the council building. And so they'll do reports and research on anything that the DC Council is funding that they ask for. So we've had reports on teacher retention and turnover. We've had reports on student mobility. Basically, she's exposing truths that DCPS is actively attempting to obscure and hide. And the council doesn't always like that, because oftentimes people like David Grosso and Phil Mendelson have put a lot of stock in the DCPS, and they don't ask a lot of questions, and they just take them at face value, even though they're clearly lying on the stand. And Kathy Patterson exposes those lies, and she exposed the at-risk funds. What we've been saying as advocates for years, ever since at-risk had become, an additional weight. We were saying that DCPS was not following the law of the council and sending it to the schools that should get that money. And they were using it to kind of push other money out of the way. We've been saying it from day one. But the council just kept saying, oh, well, let's ask DCPS. And DCPS is like, no, it's all good. And the council was like, okay, I guess it's all good. And Kathy Patterson showed that it is, in fact, not all good. And what we were saying was absolutely true. So she's a major ally in trying to get more reports kind of into her hands, and getting her more issues that she can research is, I think, a big deal for us, because unfortunately, even though we come and we tell truth to power over and over again, too often our elected leaders have too much at stake, and they'd rather look good than be good. And Kathy Patterson is not afraid of telling the truth. She's a huge ally in our part. Oops, sorry. So they're kind of under the council. She's under the council. She does not work for the mayor. Here we have the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education in its current form is also a product of the legislation on mayoral control. It is called the State Board of Education because its job is to advise OSSE, who is acting like the state when it comes to our federal laws and grants around education. The State Board of Education is advisory. They have very few opportunities to have a substantive vote, very few, which is not their fault as elected leaders. It is the fault of the legislation that created mayoral control. WTU now has a majority of members on the State Board of Education who are friendly to the Washington Teachers Union and our positions. Some certainly more friendly than others, but we do have a majority. So they have conducted their own research and reports to assist us and to demonstrate and bring to the council's attention issues. And the council has then paid more attention when they've brought them to them. I wish it didn't require that, but again, everyone claims to respect us, but what they do usually belies their lack of respect. Their main points of advocacy can be around the the implementation of federal laws like ESSA. Now, ESSA is a big deal. It's the national framework for how we get a lot of education funding, as well as sets up these school report cards. So that's really kind of where their direct influence lies, but a lot of it does lie in them giving us a space to testify, because as you've probably noticed as educators, the mayor doesn't set up a monthly, come let me hear about schools forum. We have the DCPS budget forum that's usually in September, and that would be it, as in that's it. They do it one time. Heck, the charter schools have more interaction with their parents than DCPS, which is terribly disappointing because they're also terrible. So really, the State Board of Education is a place for educators to get our voices on the record, to have them amplified by people who are friendly to us, and to be quite honest, to win symbolic battles. Every election with the State Board of Education is an election where the Democrats for Education Reform, funded fully by the Waltons, and Washington Teachers Union go head to head over what vision we want in education. We have been winning lately more than we are losing. And we are being outspent $250,000 to 1 because we don't spend any money on it. And they spend more than any other, and I mean any other group in the district. There are people with wads of cash trying to keep the system of mayoral control in place. And we have to win these symbolic battles. We have to keep changing the narrative, even if it feels largely symbolic, which right now it is. Now, another thing I would posit for why it does matter is that Mary Shea, the DC Council, has introduced legislation. It's not gone anywhere, but it could in the future. She's introduced legislation that would have OSSI be transferred, zoom out here, out from under the mayor and to being under the State Board of Education. So it would amend the Public Education Reform Act, take OSSI away from the mayor, put it under the State Board of Education, giving them actual power and an actual check and balance, where OSSI could actually oversee DCPS and the DC Public Charter School Board. Get a whole new superintendent, change that office so they're no longer serving at the mayor's pleasure. I think that could be a good incremental change if we can't win total mayoral control. There have also been arguments made that basically we need OSSI to be over, or sorry, we need the State Board of Education to be over OSSI. And then we would further need another Board of Education to be over DC Public Schools that would be elected and not appointed by the mayor. Kind of like then how the DC Public Charter School Board has their school board. And that would give then the parents and the teachers and everyone who works for DCPS another point of avenue. And that would kind of be so that, again, OSSI is not solely under the mayor's control. Well, most counties are in states, so that's the problem, right? The problem is that we don't have a governor that's separate from the mayor. And so the question just is basically, how do we get it so that there is a check and balance in education and that it's not all just up to the mayor? But there are different ways, I mean, certainly that are worth looking into, and I'm not going to claim to have the answer on how we can get back democracy into our public schools while also not maybe falling into the traps of the past that we so often hear were really terrible. All right, I'm going to just kind of try to wrap this up here by just talking a little bit about some of the non-governmental groups just to have on your radar. So I might tend to simplify. I don't think anyone's shocked. But that basically there are those who are for neighborhood public schools and there are those who are for privatization or charter schools in this district. And when we're about 50-50, this really starts to kind of play out in very stark ways. So maybe being pro-charter is kind of the wrong thing. We should say pro-privatization, and they'll take it any way they can get it. On the public side, we of course have our parent union, the American Federation of Teachers, as well as the Network for Public Education, who on a national level really do try to advocate for public schools and against privatization. And they have a lot of, their website's pretty cool. On the charter side, we have billionaires. Of course we do. So on the charter side, we have the Walton Foundation, Eli Broads. You could go on and on, Bill and Melinda Gates, Chan Zuckerberg, the Koch brothers, but the two big players right now that most directly influence DC are Walton and Broad foundations. And you'll notice the DCPS gets a lot of Walton money too. That's not a shocker. DC Public Schools central office is practically a wannabe charter. The way they treat us, that's for sure. In terms of some of the non-governmental education advocacy groups here in the district, should probably say district. We have, of course, us, the Washington Teachers Union, and we are part of a coalition for DC public schools that calls itself C for DC. This is made up of ward-based education councils, associations, and alliances, as well as groups like Teaching for Change, 21st Century School Fund, the Senior High Alliance of Parents, Principals, and Educators. It's all a bunch of really small, locally based groups that have been around sometimes for more than 20 years, who are trying to protect our neighborhood public school system against all those who are funded by Walton. Walton pays for just about everything in this district. I don't know why they care so much, but they do. They live in Alabama. Should stick to their own, but they don't. Walton is funding the DC Charter Alliance that used to be called Focus DC. They fund Democrats for Education Reform, which is the big player in our elections. As I said, they spend more than any other group. That includes developers. They spend more than developers. Sometimes even if you combine all the developers, Democrats for Education Reform is still spending more than them. They really are just dropping hordes of cash into elections, which is hilarious because they often lose. We have Ed Reform Now, which is part of a national network, but there's a DC chapter that is quite active. We have the DC Education Coalition for Change. Some of our teachers union members are a part of that, but when you look at where their funding comes from, their 990 is filed under Teach for America's Lee program, which is funded by the Waltons. So we do have to wonder what the money's going for. And then we have PAVE, or the Parents Amplifying Voices in Education. They get about $3 million from Walton in the past couple years. So that's a lot of money, all coming from basically one organization, one that is funding all of these things. So you have to wonder what is going on. Why are the Waltons funding these groups? I tend to refer to them as AstroTurf because they're not really of and by this district, at least not where they're being funded. We then have civic organizations, parent-teacher associations, local school advisory teams, the local charter school executive boards, of course our ANCs, though those are, elected, and I wish I could fit them in there somewhere, but this chart's already complicated enough. But they do have a role to play here, and I'll probably just have to update it at some point and try to fit them in. Just a couple websites here. C for DC Public Schools. This is a great chance to find meetings. I think the Waltons, this is just a largely symbolic fight because we have so much interaction with Congress. This is their chance to kind of have an experiment on us and say, look, charters are better. Let's close all the public schools. Oh, wow, let's have more private schools. And then, and yes, Sophia's absolutely right. They don't just do this in DC. I think DC is so small that their money can wield extreme influence. And it may be harder for them and others to be quite as like this, but yep, they're doing this all over the place. Empower Ed. Yeah, Empower Ed, I think is kind of one of the true groups that maybe is in both, or in, is maybe a little harder to classify in terms of these groups on the right because they don't take money from the Waltons or anything like that. So they're not being funded by that crew. And they do bring together DCPS and charter teachers and educators. So I'm not sure where I would put them. I think they do have positive and negative relationships. It's like, I guess, anything. I'm probably not the best person to ask, but I do know we do have WTU members who are active in Empower Ed. And that can never be a bad thing, have our members all over the place. I think it's just, a matter of when we're on the same page, then we're on the same page. And one just really awesome blog if you want a lot of detail and reading a bunch of FOIA documents and someone who really just refuses to give up on finding out what's going on in DCPS and the public charter sector is educationdc.net. It's run by a parent. Her student attends Duke Ellington. And she is just kind of extremely intrepid. and really wants to preserve democracy in our schools. And she uses FOIA and her extensive knowledge kind of the law to try and get at the truth of what is going on and what is often being kept hidden from us. And I learn a lot from her. So that's kind of what I've got. I don't know if there's additional questions. I know I went very fast, very big, very confusing. And I editorialized a lot on what to do. So that's a good question, David. What can we do to change this? I think largely the power is in the hands of the Council of DC. And there's different ways to influence the Council of DC. One, replace people who suck. We've been doing that slowly but surely. Obviously, Janice was a huge win in Ward 4, replacing Brandon Todd. Brandon Todd was a super pro mayoral control, and Janice ran extremely openly against mayoral control. And she brings it up all the time, which is just awesome. She's a huge champion of our cause. So we are close, in my opinion, to having a majority of the council who may be interested, or at least who are positive on the idea that mayoral control needs to be changed. How much can be hard to say. And of course, you know, they can all maybe be in favor of it and openly say that, but are they willing to spend the time and really go into it? And we know it will be controversial when there will be a ton of money. Remember, the Waltons are here. They are here to preserve mayoral control. It is what they care about. Vanola, go ahead. Did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to address David's question. What are the next steps? And I want to let him know that we actually just talked about this in our executive board meeting on Saturday when I brought it up as an initiative for the WTU to work on. So we are in the embryonic stages of staking out a strategy to actually get rid of mayoral control. So more information is forthcoming, but we are already on the case, so to speak.
Yep, and it's going to be an all hands on deck kind of situation. I think at the next COPE meeting, we're hoping that Vanola will chair a subcommittee that is going to begin tackling this. So, you know, in the next 12 minutes, you can head over to the next Zoom room, WTU Zoom room, and we'll be talking about a lot of this, about how to try to influence politics and hopefully maybe get a campaign going that really does tackle mayoral control head on.
What yeah, Laura, I just wanted to, am I still on?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I just want to say that that we're actually going to be working out of the communications committee, and it's going to be chaired by Gleason and I. And of course, we'll work in conjunction with the COPE committee and the organizing committee, but the strategy and everything will be coming out of the communications committee. So we just decided that this morning.
Okay.